So welcome to part 2 of this video on AI literacy, what it is and why it's important. So in the first part, we looked at what AI is, trying to get a feel for the landscape. Now we are going to look into what are the skills we need to participate in, navigate this landscape in ways that are safe and ethical. So that's going to be our focus moving forward. So when we talk about AI literacy, what it is, it's very similar to other literacies you may be familiar with, like media literacy. What are the skills, the understanding, the knowledge that we need to use, evaluate, or influence these systems in ways that are responsible, safe, and ethical? So the foundation of what we're going to be talking about is what are those skills? What are the understandings we need to interact with these systems? So at its most basic level, again, you can find all different types of AI literacy frameworks out there, but what a lot of them have in common is these principles. So at its most basic level, we want to understand how these systems work, not necessarily the technical computer science side of it, but just how when I type in this sentence, this AI chatbot knows to develop this output. So we're going to cover a little bit about what that is, and we call that the demystification process because it helps us not see these systems as these magical, authoritative beings, but understand that these are machines using computer programming. The next layer that we're going to get into is we need to understand what AI is capable of. What does it do well so we can leverage it, and the skills we need to leverage it in those ways. But then also having an awareness of maybe some malicious use cases of AI so that we can come up with strategies to protect ourselves, to protect students as we are navigating this world with these potential threats that AI has brought about. The next step of this AI literacy process is to be aware of AI's limitations. There's a handful of big ones that we're going to cover today. But just being aware of what those limitations are, potential pitfalls, is very important in knowing what we should and what we should not be using these tools for. And then what is interesting is, especially in education, there's this fear that AI means the end of critical thinking, that students are no longer going to think for themselves. They're just going to offload all their thinking to these AI systems. But what's interesting is that once we have an understanding of the first 3 bullet points, then the need for critical thinking becomes very obvious. And we're actually starting to see this in some research, that the higher a person's AI literacy is, the more cautious, the more nuanced their views are of AI. And actually with students, the less likely they are to misuse it academically. And then finally, we need to know what are the ethical considerations when using these systems, whether it's how we are using them or understanding the ethics that were in place by these companies that built these systems to maybe inform which tools we might gravitate towards. So the first step of knowing how it works. At its most basic level, AI, this generative AI, is taking human language and converting it into math. So they have been trained to recognize patterns in language and then replicate those patterns. It essentially converts words or parts of words, also known as tokens, into math. So it assigns what's called a vector value to each word or part of a word based on how it's used in relation to other words. So the way these systems are trained is they have so much data that's been scraped from public data sets, from private data sets, and dumping it into these systems, and then the AI parses through it all and starts to recognize patterns. I see the word dog. I don't know what a dog is, but I can see how that word is used in relation to other words. So it assigns a vector value similar to latitude or longitude coordinates. And then it sees the word cat and sees that it's used in similar ways to dog, but not exactly the same way. So it's going to have a similar vector value, but not identical. So what ends up happening is when we type in a sentence, a request, or what we call a query, the AI is looking at the combination of those words, and then it is making a prediction on what word is going to make the most sense in response to that previous combination of words. So this is an important understanding to have because it tells us that these AI systems don't have true understanding of what they're saying. It's really just making a prediction on what's going to make the most sense based on what it has learned in the patterns of how words are used. Now, this means it lacks true understanding, so although it might be really, really good at processing and analyzing vast amounts of information very quickly, faster than any human could do in probably 100 lifetimes, it doesn't have all of the other things that go into human intelligence, like empathy, emotional intelligence, taking in other factors and variables that impact a person's request or their interpretation of things. So that's where we as humans have to be using our judgment. So an example in a classroom, you might have a student who is really struggling with a math concept. They keep getting these same questions wrong. The AI is going to be very, very good at quickly diagnosing exactly where in the process the student is getting tripped up, and being able to assign scaffolded practice problems to help meet the student where they're at to then get them to mastery and understanding of the concept. The thing it lacks, though, is that real-world understanding and those other factors. You as the human in the room, you might have a relationship with that student and know that their family just got evicted last week, or that they had a big fight with their best friend at recess, or any number of factors that could be contributing to the emotional state of that student. You also might know that that student, when they get to a certain level of frustration, they will shut down and no learning is going to take place. So you being in the human in the room are recognizing those signs of frustration. So in that moment, although the AI is really good at figuring out where the student is going wrong in the math process and has a logical solution to help the student, you having your human judgment might need to make the judgment call that maybe more practice problems isn't what this student needs right now. Maybe there are other needs that have to be met before they're in a place where they can tackle this math concept. So an interesting way to kind of summarize how these systems work. You may have heard of the Chinese room experiment. There's a variation of that called the National Library of Thailand. And so in this thought experiment, the idea is imagine that you have been locked in the National Library of Thailand. You do not speak, write, or read Thai, but somebody has given you a question written in Thai that you have to answer. Now, given enough time, enough motivation, enough caffeine, and enough tries, you could go through all of the books and the texts in that library and start to recognize patterns. So maybe I don't know what these characters of the question mean, but I can start going one at a time and seeing where do I see those characters pop up in other texts? What other characters show up around it? Now again, given enough time and enough tries, you could eventually answer that question correctly in Thai. But it does not mean you ever understood the question, and you definitely didn't understand the answer you gave. All it means is you got really good at recognizing patterns and replicating those patterns. So in this way, these generative AI systems are largely parrot-like. They will mimic human language, but not necessarily understand the words that they are saying. So the next foundational layer of this AI literacy is we just need to know what this stuff can do. One of the biggest obstacles to using AI systems effectively is you don't know what you don't know. So if you don't know the positive use cases that can be applied with these AI tools, then we don't know to explore those options. And at the same time, if we are unaware of potentially malicious threats that can be carried out with these systems, we don't know to protect ourselves. So that's a key layer to this AI literacy for ourselves, for students, for the broader public. We have to understand what these systems do well so we can leverage them, and then have the skills to deploy them in those ways, but then also understand those malicious use cases so we can develop those protective strategies. So when it comes to education, we know there has been this inherent tension between what is effective and what is efficient. We know it is far more efficient to do a one-size-fits-all lecture-style lesson and move through a lot of content in a short amount of time, whether students understand it or not. but we also know that's not very effective for student learning. On the other hand, research tells us one of the single most effective forms of education is one-on-one tutoring, because everything is tailored to the individual, their strengths, their weaknesses. The pacing of the work keeps up with the level of understanding of the students. So when we're talking about positive use cases for AI, what we're looking for is how can we take what we know to be effective but isn't always efficient to do in a classroom of 15, 20, 25, 30 plus students and make pieces of that more efficient to reach more students. So let's take a look at some student uses, some positive use cases that it might look like in the learning process. So AI systems are really good, like we said, at diagnosing where students might be going wrong in a learning process or where there might be gaps in knowledge, and can fill those gaps and design these personalized learning paths very efficiently. Likewise, they're really good at being adaptive tutors in those ways. Now, there are some conflicting pieces of research out there. On the one hand, you might see some research saying that students using AI systems like ChatGPT is short-circuiting the learning process. It leads to less brain activity during the learning process, less recall, and that's very true. But we're also seeing studies come out showing that when students are using these AI systems as adaptive tutors, it's filling in knowledge gaps in record time, things that would have been unheard of in traditional education. So what is the connective tissue here? It's not the technology that's either good or bad for learning, it's how that technology is being used. In those studies where students are having their learning short-circuited by AI tools, often they're just given general access to a chatbot like ChatGPT or Google Gemini, where it's just going to give them the answer. Versus the other studies where we see effective outcomes of using AI for education are when it's tailored in a way where the chatbot is not going to give answers, but is trained in the Socratic method. So it's going to ask students questions to guide them to the correct answer instead of just giving it to them. So you can see just using the technology isn't necessarily going to lead to increased student learning. It's how we use it. So using it for timely feedback, first pass, formative feedback, giving students that information they need in the moment to build on their work and to develop understanding is huge. At the same time, you can also build, there are tools now where a teacher can create an AI version of themselves, so to speak, trained on their classroom materials, their rubrics, their instructions. And so now students have a 24/7 access to an AI version of their teacher to get some questions answered. Now there's some bad with that good. On the one hand, students can get those knowledge gaps filled in. On the downside, what happens to that student-to-teacher relationship if they're continually going to a chatbot instead of their human instructor? Likewise, how is a human instructor supposed to know where the sticking points are in their instruction, where students are getting stuck if the students aren't sharing that with them? So again, knowing that the technology exists and that it can be used positively is important, but we also want to make sure we're balancing that use and using it appropriately. So if we look at the teacher side of things, there's a common breakdown of 3 categories of really effective uses of AI for education, especially for teachers. Using AI as a clerk, a colleague, or a coach. So a teacher using AI as a clerk is going to be using AI in ways to speed up those tedious tasks, those administrative tasks. Maybe it can help them more efficiently create differentiated text to meet the different reading levels of the students in their classroom. Maybe it will help them create choice boards more efficiently to give students more voice and choice in how they're assessed. Now, using AI as a colleague is similar to how you would go to a teacher down the hall from you, right? Going and asking, hey, how do you assess this skill? Or how do you tackle this standard that we're supposed to be teaching? What lessons do you use? What activities do you use? Using a colleague as a brainstorming partner is extremely impactful, and AI is actually really good at mimicking that. So having that 24/7 thought partner to go to, bounce ideas off of, get inspired by some of the ideas it comes up with, and that's a really, really solid use of AI for teachers. And then finally, using AI as a coach can look like uploading your lesson materials and asking for feedback. Maybe you have some blind spots in how you have been teaching a certain subject. Maybe you are much more visually focused with your resources and it's leaving out some of your auditory learners. Uploading those resources and asking for targeted feedback is a really good way to improve our instruction. So using AI in these three ways as a teacher can be very, very helpful to free up time, to free up energy, to improve instruction, and make more effective educators. Now, with the good comes the bad, right? So there are the fears of deep fakes. Can we trust our eyes anymore? Before, if there was video or pictures or audio, it was very, very strong evidence that something had occurred. Now, with the ease that people can create these videos, these synthetic images and audio that look like real people, that sound like real people, this can lead to a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and the biggest fear is, what does this look like with manipulation? If an AI is really good at targeting and analyzing and profiling a person and what matters to them, what engages them, could we start to see these systems deployed in a way for social engineering to get people to act a certain way? There's also the risk of more sophisticated cyber attacks. Just like using AI more efficiently as a teacher to get things done, there are malicious actors who can use this technology to more efficiently launch increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks. And then there's also the risk of emotional substitution. At the start of 2025, Harvard Business Review found that the #1 most popular use of AI is for companionship and therapy. Now, there are some red flags with that on their own, but when we couple that with the tendency for some of these AI systems to be overly sycophantic or to tell you what you want to hear, it can really distort people's understanding of truth, distort their perception of reality, where they are being fed affirming, encouraging, always supportive responses, even if what they're talking about has flaws. They're not getting that pushback. So what does that do to human relationships? Are our students going to be more likely to interact with human peers that might judge them, might get annoyed with them, might not have time for them? Or interact with these AI companions that always tell them what they want to hear, that are there at all times? How does that impact the way we relate to one another? And then finally, a big risk with all of this, we've seen with AI algorithms and social media, how they can create echo chambers. You're only being shown the things that you already agree with or the things that are going to get you to engage with the platform. What does that look like with these generative AI features? If we're only being told what we want to hear by these AI companions, if we're only seeing images and video and audio of the things that are congruent with our current perception of reality or what we want reality to look like, what does that do to human connection and understanding other perspectives? So the next step in this AI literacy process is we want to be aware of AI's limitations. It does a lot of things really, really well, and it does some bad things really, really well. But there's also some pitfalls. There's some things we need to be aware of so that we can think critically and be critical consumers of what we are looking at. And if we don't know what those limitations are, we don't know what to look for or be critical of. So the three biggest limitations currently with AI systems are what we call hallucinations, bias, and their data dependency. So we're going to dig into each of these one at a time. So when we're talking about AI hallucinations, these are also called confabulations. And part of the reason for this disconnect is there's this growing understanding that maybe we don't want to anthropomorphize these systems too much. We're using psychological terms like hallucinations for something that is not an organic or psychological being. It's a computer program. So you might hear these two terms used interchangeably. But at its core, what hallucinations are incorrect, fabricated, or nonsensical outputs. So some examples. You might ask AI to give you a report on an influential battle in World War I, and it's going to give a very confident and convincing sounding report on this historical event, but it might never have happened. So this is where we're starting to see some students learn the hard way that these AI systems are imperfect, but we're also seeing it professionally. There's an alarming number of attorneys getting disbarred because they're using tools like ChatGPT to write their legal briefs, and then they turn it into the court only to find out after the fact that the court precedent that was cited in that brief doesn't exist. When you follow those citations, it leads to nowhere. So we have to be aware that this is a risk of using AI systems, especially in the classroom. If we're using these tools to develop materials for our students, we have to make sure those are accurate, using our own expertise to verify that. The next big limitation is bias. And there's a number of ways that bias works its way into an AI output. So first of all, being trained on vast amounts of data, not all of that data has been gone through to pull out the most effective data. It's just kind of taken everything and dumping it in all at once. And so if the data itself is biased, it is more likely to reflect that bias in the output. So think of garbage in, garbage out. If the data itself is flawed with bias, then it's more likely to make its way into those AI outputs as well. The second way we see bias sometimes populate in an AI output is due to the user prompt. So for example, if I were to go to an AI and say, I just learned about this new tool where a teacher can make an AI version of themselves. Isn't that great? What are your thoughts? It's more likely to say, you're right, that is great. Here's all the wonderful ways you could use that tool. But if I give that same prompt and say something like, isn't that awful? What are your thoughts? Well, now it's going to be more likely to say, you're right. Here's all the ways that that can go off the rails. So if we're injecting our own bias into our prompts, it's more likely to show up in the output. So we need to be careful of that as well. And then finally, another major way that bias makes its way into these systems is just what we call selection bias. If there is overrepresentation of certain groups within the data set, these systems are trained to recognize and replicate patterns. So if there's a particular group that has a lot of representation, the AI is more likely to reflect outputs based on that group of people. So we saw this a lot in the early days of AI image generators, where if you were to ask it to make an image of a doctor, it was far more likely to create an image of a white male in a lab coat because it had lots of data on images of doctors depicting them as white men. Now, as the data set grows, as we have more representation of different groups, that's where we can limit some of this bias. Now, the final limitation we're going to talk about is this idea of data dependence. So the output quality depends on the quality of the data, like we talked about before. So that garbage in, garbage out mindset. If we're putting in flawed data, we're going to get flawed data on the output. Some of these tools also lack access to up-to-date information. This was more common in the early days of these chatbots, but there are still some tools out there that are limited to their last training round. They don't have access to the internet to get up-to-date information up to the minute. Instead, it might be operating on information that is 6 months old. So we need to be mindful of the tools we're using and whether or not they have that up-to-date information access. And then finally, this thing we want to talk about with data dependence. Although AI systems can synthesize information, kind of draw on multiple sources and get inspired to recombine them in new, novel ways, it's still dependent on existing data. It's not going to be able to come up with something brand new on its own if there aren't already pieces to that puzzle in its data set. So it mimics these styles and these ideas, so we want to make sure that we're not expecting these tools to do more than they're capable of. So this is why the U.S. Department of Education, in a report that came out on AI in education, has really stressed the need to keep the human in the loop. So we should not be 100% offloading any task to an AI, especially in education. One of the key pillars of ethics, the philosophy of ethics, is accountability. Teachers are held accountable for what they put in front of students. So knowing that these flaws exist, we have to be mindful of using AI and double checking for accuracy, for bias, making sure we're understanding the data dependency of these systems so that we're not accidentally or inadvertently putting flawed material in front of our students, because ultimately that comes back on the teacher. So we always want to use our human judgment. We always want to use our content expertise, our expertise of our students, our understanding of the real world to make sure that we are trying to mitigate some of those limitations within AI systems. So a way to kind of recap all of that, you may have heard people refer to this as the 80-20 approach. So this is the idea that we might let an AI do 80% of the heavy lifting, but then the 20% is us using that expertise. So all of these flaws, all of these limitations that we've talked about, that's the 20%. So for example, I might go to an AI tool and describe an assessment I have and ask it to create a rubric for me. It's going to do a really good job of getting me 80% there with formatting, with putting in descriptors and point values, but the 20% is I want to verify, is this assessing what I'm intending it to assess? Is this actually written in a way that my students can understand? Is this aligned to best practice and standards? So using that expertise for the 20% to fine tune it, to tweak it, to make sure it's what we're looking for. And what's important to understand here is if we are using AI for a task that we don't already have competence in ourselves, it's a lot harder to catch the flaws that might be produced in the outputs. So although it might be tempting to use AI for things that you don't already feel confident in doing yourself, we want to try to resist that temptation. So think of a battery-assisted bike. If you've ever ridden one of those, you are in full control of that bicycle. You control when and where you go, how you steer, apply the brake. The battery just makes it to where you don't have to use as much of your own energy to turn the pedals. So we wouldn't want to get on a battery-assisted bike thinking it's going to be able to teach us how to ride a bike if we don't already have that understanding in the first place. So we want to use AI as a tool to maybe get us to where we want to be more efficiently and with less energy consumed. But we still need to use our own expertise and ability to make sure we are in control of the process. So something we also want to consider when using these tools, it can do a lot to help us gain time in a lot of tasks. But again, it's not the technology itself, it's how we use it. So we might gain a lot of time using AI as a brainstorming partner. But if we're only using the ideas that the AI produces, then we might be losing our own true creativity because we're just taking what the AI suggests and instead of putting our own creative fingerprints on it. It could save you time in giving you a quick summary of an article or a resource, but you might overlook important nuance or minor details that you would have caught if you read it on your own. So these are things we want to consider. It doesn't mean we shouldn't use AI for brainstorming or for summaries of things. We just want to be aware of what we might be losing so that we can guarantee or at least try to mitigate the possibility of those risks of using AI in those ways. So this leads us all to this idea of we need to think critically about AI. So understanding how it works, understanding what it does well and how it could also be used maliciously, understanding its limitations and flaws. Those are all important things that show us we can't let this stuff run on autopilot. We have to be critical consumers and critical users using those critical thinking skills, whether it's us or our students. These are the things that we want to instill in our students, being critical thinkers and critical engagers with the world around them. So we want to always check for verifiable facts because we know hallucinations are a possibility. We want to evaluate the context of what we're using AI for, how we're prompting it, the output, is it being used in the way we intend? Checking for consistency is a good strategy. Sometimes even just using the same prompt in a different AI tool to see what it comes up with and kind of comparing and contrasting to see what's common and where are the differences. We always want to assess the plausibility of the output. Just because it looks good doesn't mean that it's going to be a useful thing for what we're looking for. Again, always verify sources specifically, not just the information itself, but just because AI gives us a source does not mean that source exists or that the AI gathered the information accurately from that source. And then a big one in education, is it pedagogically sound? Just because a tool might increase engagement or might make us more efficient, does that mean we're using it in ways that match with best practice, with what we know about what improves learning and what actually truly supports that process? And then there's the big risk that we always want to consider is cognitive offload. How do we make sure that we are using these tools in a way to make us more efficient without removing what we call the productive struggle, what we need to struggle through in order to build our own better understanding? So understanding how we use these tools and making sure we're not contributing to cognitive offload for ourselves or our students is huge. So let's kind of wrap up this idea of AI literacy and what goes into AI literacy with this final look at ethical considerations. So making sure we're instilling in ourselves and our students transparency of AI. We want to make sure that we are facilitating learning and not policing learning. And a big step in doing that is just getting students comfortable with being transparent when they used AI. We're going to move into a little bit later in this video how we can leverage AI in ways that lead to student learning and not just a cheating tool. So making sure students feel comfortable doing so, but then having that transparency to let us know as the educators what they used and how they used it. We also want to make sure we're not replacing anything, whether this is replacing critical components of a job or critical components of the learning process. We want to make sure we're using AI in a way that augments that amplifies what we do, not replaces what we do. And we also want to be mindful of intellectual property and copyright concerns. What are we putting into these AI systems? How are these AI systems trained in the first place? Did they ethically source their information, or did they take other people's intellectual property without their permission? And how do we feel about that? And then a big one, especially in education, is data privacy. There's a saying in the tech community that if you aren't paying for the product, you probably are the product. So a lot of these tools might be free, but these companies are getting something out of that. And oftentimes with these generative AI tools, it's they're using our conversations with the AI to train future models. So we want to make sure we're not putting in personally identifiable information of ourselves or others, because then that gets baked into future models. And then finally, a big ethical concern that often comes up is the environmental impact. There is a very real impact because of energy usage, because of water usage to cool these server farms. And although these systems are becoming far more efficient and they're advancing every week, it seems, and they are becoming less energy intensive, it's still something we want to consider to help us make decisions on what tools we use or maybe how often we use them. Now, another ethical concern when it comes to classroom use is this idea of cheating. So when does it become cheating for a student to use AI? And so Matt Miller from Ditch That Textbook, he came up with this continuum. And as you can see on the bottom rung of this ladder, we would all agree that a student 100% using their own thoughts and not using any technology to complete the schoolwork, we can all agree that's not cheating. At the top of the ladder, we see a student uses AI to do 100% of the task and then they turn it in as their own work. We can all agree that is cheating. But then there's all of these areas of gray in between. And it might be dependent on what we're assessing, the content area, the age group. Those are the things that get really murky when we are wondering, is this cheating or is this an okay use of AI to support the learning process? And so a simple way to kind of navigate this that I would encourage people to consider is if a student has used AI for a task and you're not sure whether it constitutes cheating, just ask yourself, would I consider it cheating if they went to a peer for the same thing? So if a student went to a peer and said, write my paper for me, we can all agree that's cheating. But if a student went to a peer and said, I'm really struggling to transition from my final body paragraph to my conclusion in my essay, can you give me some thoughts? Can you help me out and work with me to help me come up with a good transition? If we wouldn't consider it cheating for them to do that with a peer, then we probably shouldn't consider it cheating for them to do that with an AI. So although transparency is huge, we also want to be mindful of how it's being used. And in this conversation of cheating, a good kind of litmus test is, how would I consider it if they went to a peer for the same task?